Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Imagine, if you will, a world burning. Not burning in the way that a candle flickers or a campfire crackles beneath a starless sky. No, this world burns in the way that only a world touched by the green tide can burn. The horizon has turned the color of rust and smoke. Great pillars of black cloud rise from the shattered remains of what were once manufactorums and habblocks, those dense hives of human labor and prayer that define so many imperial worlds across the breadth of the galaxy. The ground shakes, not with the steady rhythm of artillery or the distant thunder of orbital bombardment, but with something far more primal and terrible. It shakes with the footsteps of millions. It shakes with the beating of crude iron weapons against stolen armor. It shakes with the rumble of engines that should not work, held together by rust and faith of a different kind than the Emperor's. Vehicles cobbled together from wreckage and scrap metal roar across the pockmarked landscape, belching exhaust fumes so thick they turn the afternoon sky into a permanent twilight. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, somewhere between the falling shells and the charging green bodies and the screaming of men who have suddenly realized that duty to the Emperor may demand more than they have left to give, a single figure in a long black greatcoat stands. His name does not matter yet. What matters is what he represents. The peaked cap on his head, decorated with the golden aquila that speaks of his devotion. The bolt pistol in his right hand, smoking from its most recent discharge. The chainsword in his left, its teeth clogged with something dark and wet. And the red-lined collar of his coat, stiff with dried blood that may or may not be his own. The look in his eyes, hard and unwavering, the kind of look forged in the furnaces of the Schola Progenium and tempered by decades of service to an institution older than the memory of most civilizations. He is a Commissar, a regional Commissar, to be precise, a man whose authority stretches across multiple regiments and whose word carries the weight of the God Emperor himself. He has spent his career ensuring that the soldiers under his purview remain faithful, remain courageous, remain devoted to the cause of humanity, even when every instinct screams at them to run. He has executed cowards. He has inspired heroes. He has stood on the parapet when the walls were crumbling and dared the darkness to come closer. But today, the darkness is not dark at all. Today, the darkness is green. Today, the Orks have come, and they have come in numbers that beggar comprehension. What happens next? What happens when the line breaks and the green flood pours through? When the bolt pistol clicks empty and the chainsword stutters and dies? When the greatest symbol of imperial authority on this battlefield finds himself not dead, but taken alive by creatures that view warfare as the highest form of entertainment? That is the story we're going to tell tonight. It is not a pleasant story. The 41st Millennium offers very few of those. But it is an important one, because it pulls back the curtain on one of the most terrifying and misunderstood aspects of the Warhammer 40k universe. We talk often about the horror of chaos, the cruelty of the Dark Eldar, or the all-consuming hunger of the Tyranids. But there is something uniquely nightmarish about falling into the hands of the Orks. Not because they are the most evil of the galaxy's many threats, but because they are the most alien in their relationship to suffering. To an Ork, pain is currency, violence is language, and a captured human, particularly one who fights back, particularly one who refuses to break, is not a victim. He is a toy that has not yet stopped being entertaining. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey through one of the darkest corners of the grimdark future. A journey that begins on a burning battlefield and ends in places that no loyal servant of the Emperor should ever have to see. This is the story of what happens when Orks capture a regional Commissar in Warhammer 40k. And we are going to tell every piece of it. Before we can understand the true weight of this scenario, before we can appreciate just how catastrophic and personally devastating the capture of a regional Commissar would be, we need to understand exactly what a Commissar is and what he represents within the vast machinery of the Imperium of man. Because a Commissar is not simply another officer. He is not merely a man with a rank and a uniform. He is something far more fundamental to the way the Imperium wages war, and his loss carries implications that ripple outward in ways that most people never fully consider. The institution of the Commissariat, formerly known as the Officio Praefectus, traces its origins back to the aftermath of the Horus heresy. That cataclysmic civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium in its infancy and left scars upon humanity that have never fully healed. When the traitor War Master Horus turned half of the Emperor's armies against their creator, one of the most devastating aspects of the betrayal was how thoroughly it had compromised the old Imperial army. Entire regiments, entire fleets, entire sectors had turned traitor, seemingly overnight, and the loyal forces that remained were left reeling, unable to trust their own comrades, uncertain of where the next knife in the back would come from. In the aftermath, when the Primarch Reboot Guilliman took upon himself the role of Imperial Regent and began the long, bloody work of reforming the Imperium's military structure, one of his most consequential decisions was the creation of what would become the Commissariat. The old Imperial army was split into two separate entities, the Astra Militarum, which handled all ground combat operations, and the Imperial Navy, which controlled all void-faring vessels. Never again would a single commander have access to both troops and ships. The link between fleet and army was severed permanently, ensuring that no future traitor could replicate the scale of Horus's rebellion. But splitting the army from the navy was only half the solution. The other half was ensuring loyalty, and for that, Guilliman drew upon a concept that had existed in one form or another since the earliest days of human warfare. He created the Commissars, men and women who would serve as the Emperor's own watchdogs, embedded within every regiment, and answerable not to the regimental chain of command, but to the Departamento Munitorum's own Commissariat. Their purpose was straightforward, even if their methods were often brutal. They were there to ensure that the soldiers of the Imperium remained loyal, remained disciplined, and remained willing to fight and die for the God Emperor no matter what horrors they faced. And the horrors they faced were legion. To become a Commissar is to endure a process of indoctrination and training that would break most ordinary humans long before it was complete. Commissar cadets are drawn from the Schola Progenium, the ecclesiarchy-run orphanages where the children of imperial officers and officials who have died in service are raised and educated. These are not comfortable places. The Schola Progenium is designed to produce individuals of unshakable faith and iron discipline, and the curriculum reflects that purpose with a ruthlessness that leaves no room for weakness or doubt. From their earliest years, future commissars are drilled in the imperial creed. They memorize catechisms by the 100. They study the Tactica Imperium until they can recite battle doctrines in their sleep. They are taught to shoot, to fight with blade and fist, to command and to obey, to endure pain and deprivation without complaint. Most importantly, they are taught to judge, for that is the Commissar's greatest and most terrible power. The power to look at a fellow human being, a soldier who has faced the same horrors and fought the same enemies, and determine whether that soldier has fulfilled his duty or fallen short. And if he has fallen short, the power to execute him on the spot. This is not a power that is granted lightly, and the training required to wield it responsibly, or at least consistently, is extensive. A cadet commissar may spend years in the field under the supervision of a senior commissar before being judged worthy of advancement. Some are promoted quickly, their natural aptitude for leadership and judgment recognized early. Others spend decades working their way up through the ranks, moving from junior commissar to full commissar to, if they survive long enough and prove themselves exceptional, the rank of Lord Commissar. The ranking structure of the Commissariat is worth understanding in some detail because it helps us appreciate exactly how significant our captured Commissar is. At the bottom of the ladder sits the Cadet Commissar, are still in training, wearing the distinctive blue trim that marks him as not yet fully formed. Above him is the junior commissar, who aids a full commissar in overseeing a regiment or ship, performing adjutant duties and beginning to take on commissarial responsibilities of his own. Then comes the standard commissar, at least one of whom is assigned to every Imperial Guard regiment. These are the men and women most soldiers think of when they hear the word, the stern figures in black greatcoats who stride the trenches with bolt pistols drawn, and the authority to kill anyone who fails in their duty. Above the standard commissar are the senior ranks. Lord Commissars are veterans of decades of service whose battlefield heroics are often legendary. Colonel Commissars are rare individuals who have been granted actual regimental command rank, leading an Astra Militarum regiment in addition to performing their normal commissarial duties. And at the very top sits the Commissar General, the senior-most rank within the entire commissariat, responsible not only for their usual duties, but for the assignment of junior commissars and the promotion of cadets. Our commissar, the one who now finds himself in the worst possible situation imaginable, holds the rank of regional commissar. This places him somewhere in the upper tiers of the hierarchy, a man whose authority extends not over a single regiment, but across an entire region of operations. Multiple regiments fall under his purview. Multiple standard commissars report to him. He has earned this position through years of exemplary service, through countless battles where his leadership and his unwavering commitment to the Emperor's cause proved decisive. He is, in every meaningful sense, a living symbol of imperial authority on the battlefield. And it is precisely this symbolic weight that makes his capture so devastating. When a standard guardsman is taken prisoner by the enemy, it is a personal tragedy and, depending on the enemy, a personal horror. But the machinery of the Imperium grinds on regardless. One soldier lost among billions is a statistic, nothing more. When a commissar falls, however, the impact is felt far more deeply. The commissar is the regiment's moral center, the embodiment of the Emperor's will made manifest in flesh and bone and iron resolve. Without him, the soldiers he shepherded begin to waver. Discipline frays at the edges. The whispered fear that was always there, always lurking beneath the surface, begins to speak louder. If even the commissar can fall, what hope do the rest of us have? And when a regional commissar falls, the effect is multiplied across every regiment in his area of operations. The loss sends shockwaves through the command structure. Other commissars, the ones who reported to him, who relied on his judgment and his authority, suddenly find themselves operating without the chain of command they depended upon. Decisions that would normally have been referred upward must now be made alone, in the heat of battle, without the reassurance that a senior voice provides. But perhaps worse than the tactical implications are the spiritual ones. A commissar is not just an officer. He is a priest of discipline, a prophet of devotion. Yet his very presence on the battlefield is meant to reassure the soldiers around him that the Emperor watches, that the Emperor cares, that their sacrifice has meaning and purpose in the grand design of the Imperium. When a commissar falls, particularly when he is taken alive and paraded before the enemy, that reassurance evaporates, and in its place creeps a doubt that no amount of catechism or prayer can fully dispel. This is what the Orks have taken. Not just a man, but a symbol. Not just an officer, but a pillar upon which the morale of thousands depends. And the Orks, in their own crude and terrible way, understand this perfectly. Now, to understand what happens to our captured commissar, we need to take a long and unflinching look at his captors. The Orks are one of the most fascinating and terrifying species in the Warhammer 40k universe, and they are almost certainly the most misunderstood. Popular culture, both within the fandom and within the Imperium itself, tends to portray them as comic relief, as big, dumb, green brutes who are more funny than frightening. And it is true that there is a dark humor to the Orks that sets them apart from the unrelenting grimness of other antagonists like the Tyranids or the forces of chaos. But make no mistake, When you strip away the comedy, when you look at what the Orks actually do to the worlds they conquer and the people they capture, there is nothing funny about them at all. They are a biological weapon, engineered in an age before human civilization existed, and they have been running wild across the galaxy ever since. Yet they are the most numerous intelligent species in existence, potentially outnumbering even humanity, and the only reason they have not crushed every other civilization beneath their green-skinned boots is that they spend almost as much time fighting each other as they do fighting everyone else. The Orks were created during a conflict so ancient and so vast that the 40k universe still bears its scars billions of years later. The war in heaven, fought between the godlike Old Ones and the terrible star-devouring entities known as the Satan, required armies on a scale that natural evolution could not provide. The Old Ones, masters of biological engineering and warpcraft, created a number of servant races to fight their wars for them. The Eldar, the Krork, precursors to the modern Orks, and others whose names have been lost to the relentless erosion of deep time. The Krork were designed to be the perfect soldier species. They were strong, resilient, aggressive, and, most importantly, self-sustaining. Unlike conventional armies that required supply lines and logistics and training academies, the Krork could reproduce on any world simply by existing. Their life cycle is a marvel of biological engineering that no other species has been able to replicate. Orks are not born in the traditional sense. They are a symbiotic organism, a fusion of animal and fungal biology that reproduces through the release of spores. Every Ork, from the smallest snotling to the mightiest warboss, continuously sheds microscopic spores throughout its life and at the moment of death releases a final burst of them. These spores settle into the soil, but germinate in darkness and eventually produce new Orks. The process is so efficient that once a world has been touched by Ork spores, it is almost impossible to fully eradicate them. The only reliable method is exterminatus, the total destruction of a planet's biosphere, and even that is not always guaranteed to work. This fungal biology gives the Orks several other advantages. Their physiology is incredibly robust. An Ork can survive injuries that would kill a human several times over. Their dense musculature and redundant biological systems allowing them to shrug off wounds that would be immediately fatal to most other species. They can regenerate from horrific damage, and their pain boys, the Ork equivalent of surgeons, have been known to successfully reattach severed limbs, swap heads between patients, and perform other procedures that would be considered medically impossible by any other standard. The simple truth is that Orks are built to take punishment, and they relish every moment of it. But the Orks' most remarkable feature is not their physical toughness or their fungal reproduction. It is their collective psychic field, that strange, pervasive energy that suffuses every gathering of greenskins and bends reality in subtle but undeniable ways. Every Ork is, to some small degree, psychic. Not in the way that a human psyker is psychic, channeling the raw energies of the warp through focused will and training. The Ork psychic field is something altogether different. It is a passive, unconscious emanation, a background hum of belief and expectation that grows stronger as more Orks gather together. This field has a very practical effect. It makes things work. Specifically, it makes Ork things work. Things that by every law of physics and engineering should not function at all. Ork weapons, vehicles, and technology are constructed from scavenged scrap and salvage, hammered together by mech boys whose understanding of engineering principles is entirely instinctive rather than learned. A human engineer looking at an Ork weapon would see nothing but a collection of mismatched parts held together by rust and hope. And yet, when an Ork picks up that weapon and believes it will fire, it does fire. When an Ork paints a vehicle red because he believes that red things go faster, that vehicle does, measurably, go faster. The collective psychic field of the Orks imposes their expectations onto reality, and reality, somewhat reluctantly, complies. But this is the species that has captured our Commissar. Not mindless beasts, not simple savages, but a genetically engineered weapon of cosmic war that has been fighting and evolving for millions of years. A species that is simultaneously the most comic and the most terrifying threat in the galaxy. A species that views combat not as a necessary evil or a grim duty, but as the highest expression of existence, the very reason they were created, and the purpose that drives every moment of their lives. Ork society is organized around a principle so simple that even the dullest greenskin can understand it. Might makes right. The biggest orc is the boss. If you disagree, you fight him. If you win, you are the new boss. If you lose, which is what happens to most challengers, you either die or learn to accept your place in the hierarchy. Well, this produces a social structure that is brutally efficient in its own way. At the top sits the war boss, the largest, strongest, and most cunning orc in any given group. His decisions are enforced by the nobs, a ruling caste of orcs who are larger and more aggressive than the rank and file. Below the nobs are the boys, the great mass of ordinary orcs who form the backbone of any fighting force. And below the boys, at the very bottom of the social ladder, are the Gretchen and Snotlings, the smaller orcoid subspecies who serve as slaves, servants, laborers, and when necessary, ammunition. This hierarchy is not static. Orcs grow larger and stronger through fighting, and an orc who wins enough battles will eventually outgrow his current position and challenge those above him. The result is a society in constant flux, with the leadership of any given tribe or warband changing hands with a frequency that would give an imperial bureaucrat heart palpitations. But the underlying principle remains the same. Strength rules, weakness is punished, and anything that is not an orc is, at best, a source of amusement and, at worst, food. It is into this world that our captured Commissar is about to be dragged. The moment of capture itself is worth examining in detail, because it is nothing like what most people imagine. In the popular imagination, prisoners of war are taken in organized fashion, with hands raised and weapons surrendered, the defeated soldier marching into captivity under the watchful eye of his captors. There is a certain dignity to the process, a tacit acknowledgement that the prisoner is still a person, is still deserving of some baseline level of treatment. Nothing about being captured by orcs resembles this. The battle has been raging for hours. The Imperial line, which held with such discipline and determination through the initial orc assault, has begun to crumble under the sheer weight of numbers. Orc warfare is not subtle. It does not rely on flanking maneuvers or precision strikes or any of the 1,000 tactical refinements that the Tactica Imperium has codified over 10,000 years of human warfare. Orc warfare is a flood. It is a green tide that simply does not stop, that absorbs casualties with the same casual indifference that a river absorbs thrown stones, that keeps coming and coming and coming until the defenders are overwhelmed, not by superior tactics, but by the sheer impossibility of killing enough of them quickly enough. The Commissar has been doing everything in his power to hold the line. He has rallied fleeing squads with the force of his voice and the threat of his bolt pistol. He has stood at the parapet when lesser men would have retreated, leading by example in the way that only a Commissar can. He has personally killed dozens of orcs, his chainsword carving through green flesh, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has been fighting the Emperor's wars since before most of the soldiers around him were born. But there are limits to what one man can do, no matter how devoted, no matter how skilled, no matter how willing to die. The orcs break through the eastern wall first. A mob of boys, each one 7 feet of green muscle and bad intentions, comes pouring through the breach like water through a broken dam. Behind them come the nobs, and even larger and meaner, armed with crude power claws and big choppers that can cleave through ceramite armor as easily as flesh. The Imperial Guardsmen in that sector fight bravely, but they are outmatched in every physical dimension. An orc boy is faster than a human, stronger than a human, tougher than a human, and, in the brutal close quarters of a breached fortification, the guardsman's advantages in training and discipline count for very little. The Commissar rallies what remains of the eastern defense and leads a countercharge. It is a desperate gamble, the kind of all-or-nothing assault that either turns the tide of a battle or gets everyone killed. For a few glorious, terrible minutes, it works. The Commissar at the head of the charge, his greatcoat streaming behind him like a battle standard, in his bolt pistol barking death into the faces of the oncoming greenskins, is a sight that inspires the guardsmen around him to feats they did not know they were capable of. They push the orcs back, reclaim the breach, begin to reform the line, and then the second wave hits. This one is different. Bigger orcs, heavier weapons, vehicles crude and belching smoke, crashing through the rubble of the broken wall. The Commissar sees a battle wagon, a massive armored transport bristling with guns and covered in crude glyphs, bearing down on his position with the unstoppable momentum of a landslide. He orders his men to fall back, to find cover, to regroup at the secondary defense line. Some of them hear him, some of them obey. Most of them are already dead. The blast catches him from the side, not a direct hit, which would have killed him instantly and spared him what comes next, but a glancing blow from an orc rocket that detonates against the wall behind him and sends him tumbling through the air in a shower of masonry and shrapnel. He hits the ground hard, his vision going white, then red, then black at the edges. His ears ring, his left arm hangs useless, something sharp and hot embedded in his shoulder. The chainsword has been ripped from his grip. The bolt pistol is still in his hand, but when he tries to raise it, his fingers will not respond. He is still conscious when the first orc reaches him. A massive boy, easily 2 meters tall, his face split by a grin that shows more teeth than any creature has a right to possess. The orc looks down at the broken human lying in the rubble and sees not a man in pain, and not a soldier in need of medical attention, not a prisoner to be processed and categorized and filed away in some orderly system. The orc sees something far more interesting than any of those things. The orc sees something that is still alive and might still fight. The great green fist closes around the collar of the Commissar's greatcoat and lifts him off the ground with the casual ease of a man picking up a dropped glove. The Commissar tries to struggle, tries to bring the bolt pistol around, tries to fire even one more shot. But the orc simply plucks the weapon from his grip with a grunt of what might be amusement and tosses it aside. Another orc picks it up immediately and begins examining it with the covetous attention of a jeweler studying a diamond. There is no processing here, no surrender form to sign, and no prisoner number to be assigned, no Geneva Convention to invoke. The orc slings the Commissar over his shoulder like a sack of grain and begins walking back toward the orc lines, pausing only to bellow something triumphant in the guttural orc tongue. Other orcs nearby turn to look. Some of them laugh, a sound like rocks being ground together in a metal drum. One of them reaches out and pokes the Commissar with a finger the size of a sausage, then draws it back and examines it when the human tries to bite. This provokes a roar of approval from the surrounding greenskins. The human has spirit. The human has fight. This is good. This means the human will last longer. The Commissar does not know it yet, but his capture has just become something that orcs value. He is not simply a prisoner. He is entertainment. He is a curiosity. He is a trophy that a canny orc can show off to his mates and brag about taking. And in the economy of an orc warband, where status is measured in teeth and victories and the quality of your loot, a fighting human, especially one who wears a fancy hat and a long coat, is worth something. It is not the kind of value that will keep him safe, but it is the kind of value that will keep him alive, at least for now, at least until they get bored. Other captured guardsmen are being gathered nearby. Some are wounded, dragged from the rubble by greenskins who handle them with all the care of children playing with insects. Others are uninjured but stunned, their weapons taken, their armor stripped, standing in small, terrified clusters surrounded by orcs who regard them with the same mild interest a farmer might show toward a particularly unusual breed of livestock. A few of the braver or more foolish captives attempt to resist or escape, and the orcs respond with a casual violence that serves as an immediate and effective lesson to the others. Not a killing blow, not usually. Death would end the entertainment. Instead, a backhand that sends the offending human sprawling, or a kick that cracks ribs but leaves the prisoner alive and chastened. The run-thirds move among the captives, and this is where things begin to take on a more structured, if no less terrifying, dimension. Run-thirds, also known as slavers, are a type of odd boy, those specialist orcs who are born with specific knowledge and aptitudes encoded in their very genes. Yet where a mech boy instinctively knows how to build machines, and a pain boy instinctively knows how to cut things apart and put them back together, a run-third instinctively understands how to manage other living creatures. They are the shepherds and slave handlers of orc society, responsible for the care and maintenance of the Gretchen and Snotling populations that perform the menial labor upon which orc civilization, such as it is, depends. Run-thirds are unusual among orcs in that they possess something approaching patience. The average orc responds to disobedience with immediate and often lethal violence, but a run-third understands, at least on some instinctive level, that you get more work out of a slave if you keep it alive and somewhat functional. Their methods are still brutal by any civilized standard, involving whips, electrified goad sticks called grot prods, and the occasional use of squig hounds, vicious little creatures that serve as the orc equivalent of guard dogs. But there is a system to it, a crude but functional approach to slave management that keeps the captives alive long enough to be useful. The run-thirds are also notable for their curiosity about other species. Where the average orc sees a non-orc as either something to fight or something to ignore, a run-third sees a potential addition to his workforce. When the warband goes to battle, the run-thirds claim surviving enemies as their personal spoils, and immediately begin the process of breaking them in. This can involve anything from simple beatings to more creative forms of persuasion, depending on the run-third's mood and the resilience of the captive. Our Commissar, with his distinctive uniform and his obvious authority, attracts particular attention. A senior run-third, larger than his fellows and draped in the crude badges of his trade, approaches the orc carrying the Commissar and engages in a brief but animated negotiation. The language is orc, that guttural, expressive tongue that sounds to human ears like a combination of barking and the collision of heavy machinery. But the body language is universal. The run-third wants the Commissar. The orc who captured him wants payment. Teeth are exchanged, those orc teeth that serve as the universal currency of greenskin society, worn out and replaced regularly enough to prevent hoarding and maintain something approaching economic stability. The Commissar changes hands. The run-third examines his new acquisition with the professional eye of a livestock dealer assessing a prize bull. He prods the human's muscles, checks his teeth, which is a darkly ironic echo of the orc currency system, peers into his eyes with a curiosity that is somehow more unsettling than outright hostility. Then he grunts, apparently satisfied, and clips a crude metal collar around the Commissar's neck. The collar is connected to a length of heavy chain, which is in turn connected to several other chains holding other captives. They are linked together, like beads on a necklace, a string of broken humanity trailing behind the run-third as he leads them away from the battlefield and into the interior of the orc encampment. While the walk itself is a descent into a world that no amount of Schola Progenium training could have prepared the Commissar for. He has studied orcs, of course. Every Commissar receives at least basic xenology education, enough to understand the threats they will face and the enemies they will fight. He knows, in an academic sense, that orcs build crude settlements and maintain a ramshackle civilization of sorts. But knowing something and experiencing it are two very different things, and nothing in his education prepared him for the sheer, overwhelming sensory assault of an orc camp in full swing. The first thing that hits him is the noise. Orc encampments are never quiet. The ambient sound of daily orc life is a constant, roiling wall of noise that assaults the ears from every direction. There are the shouts of orcs arguing, Which sounds different from the shouts of orcs fighting only in that the arguments tend to be slightly less lethal. There is the clang of metal on metal as mech boys hammer away at their latest creations in open-air workshops scattered throughout the camp. There is the snarl and snap of squigs, those strange, aggressive little creatures that serve as everything from pets to food to weapons, depending on the variety and the orc's mood. There is the deeper, more menacing rumble of engines being tested, of vehicles being revved to obscene speeds for no reason other than that the driver enjoys the noise. And beneath it all, beneath the chaos and the clamor, there is a sound that is harder to identify but impossible to ignore once you become aware of it. It is the hum of the Gestalt psychic field. That's that pervasive psychic energy generated by the presence of so many orcs in one place. It is not a sound that the ears can hear exactly. It is more of a pressure, a vibration in the back of the skull that makes the teeth ache and the fillings in your ears ring. Human psychers have described it as an overwhelming green noise, a static of raw aggression and excitement that drowns out everything else. For a non-psyker like our Commissar, it manifests as a vague but persistent sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental about reality is slightly off-kilter, that the normal rules governing the universe have been suspended in this place and replaced with something cruder and more dangerous. Then there is the smell. If the noise is the first assault on the senses, the smell is the second, and in many ways it is worse. Orcs are not known for their hygiene, and an orc encampment smells like a combination of things that no human nose was designed to endure. There is the sharp, fungal musk of orc biology, that distinctive green skin odor that is part sweat, part spore, and part something that has no human equivalent.
Quick, I just want to jump in here with a personal thought before we keep going. Honestly, the more I researched this topic, the more I realized how underrated the orcs are as genuine horror villains in 40k. We always talk about chaos and the Dark Eldar when it comes to the nightmare fuel, and rightfully so, but there's something uniquely unsettling about the orcs that I think gets lost behind the memes. The idea that your suffering is not personal, that you are not being tortured out of malice or cruelty, but simply because your pain is background noise to creatures who view the entire universe as a playground. It's almost worse than being hated. At least hatred acknowledges you exist. The orcs just genuinely do not care, and I think this is what makes a scenario like this one so disturbing. But yeah, that was just my take on it. Let's get back to the video.
There is the heavy, oily stench of crude promethium fuel and the acrid bite of poorly refined ammunition. There is the coppery tang of blood, both orc and otherwise, that clings to every surface. There is the smell of squig, which is its own unique category of olfactory horror. And there is the underlying rot of organic waste, because orcs are not particularly concerned with sanitation and tend to simply dump their refuse in pits that are disturbingly similar in appearance to their fighting arenas. The visual landscape is equally overwhelming. An orc encampment looks like a junkyard that has been struck by a tornado and then colonized by an army of colorblind graffiti artists. Structures are built from whatever materials are available, which means they are an unpredictable mix of scavenged imperial architecture, crude orc construction, and the looted remains of whatever poor civilization occupied this land before the greenskins arrived. Walls are made of hammered scrap metal, decorated with crude glyphs and the mounted skulls of enemies. Roofs, where they exist, are patches of fabric and metal sheeting held together by rivets the size of a man's fist. Everything is decorated with the bold, primary colors that orcs favor: heavy blacks and vivid reds and bright yellows, are often applied in patterns that have cultural significance to the clan, but look to human eyes like the work of extremely enthusiastic but thoroughly untalented children. The Commissar is led through all of this, chained to his fellow captives, watching with the trained eye of a military observer, even as the human part of him recoils from what he sees. He notes the layout of the camp, the location of the vehicle parks and the weapons caches, the disposition of the orc forces, and the approximate numbers of greenskins present. Old habits die hard, and even now, even in chains, some part of him is already planning, already looking for weaknesses, already thinking about how this information might be used if he ever finds a way to transmit it back to Imperial forces. But another part of him, the part that the Schola Progenium tried to burn away but never quite managed to extinguish, the part that is simply human, looks at the Ork encampment and feels something that all his training and faith cannot entirely suppress. He feels fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of combat, which he has faced and mastered 1,000 times. This is something deeper, something colder, something that settles into the bones and refuses to leave. It is the fear of the unknown, the fear of being completely and utterly at the mercy of creatures who do not share a single frame of reference with you, who do not understand mercy or compassion or the concept of human dignity, who look at you not as a fellow sentient being, but as a thing to be used and discarded when its usefulness runs out. He has sent men to their deaths, while he has watched entire regiments be consumed by the engines of war. He has witnessed horrors that would drive lesser men to madness. But nothing in his long and terrible career has prepared him for the experience of being property. The slave pens are located at the periphery of the camp, downwind from the main Ork settlement, which is a small mercy given the smells emanating from the encampment proper. They are crude enclosures, little more than fenced areas surrounded by walls of scrap metal topped with coils of barbed wire, some of it Imperial issue, and crude Ork equivalents that involve jagged metal strips and the occasional squig carcass hung up to discourage climbing. The pens are divided into sections, though the organizational logic is Orkish rather than human and therefore largely incomprehensible. Some sections contain humans, crammed together in conditions that make the worst Imperial hab block look like a luxury accommodation. Others contain Gretchen, who have displeased their masters and been temporarily demoted to slave status, a fate that the tiny greenskins regard with roughly the same level of horror that a human might reserve for being sentenced to death. Still others contain creatures from species the Commissar does not recognize, Xenos prisoners taken in campaigns across the sector, their alien forms huddled in corners and watching the new arrivals with expressions that transcend the species barrier. The human section of the slave pens is where our Commissar is deposited, his chain unclipped from the communal line and reattached to a heavy iron stake driven into the ground. He is given no food, no water, and no explanation of what is expected of him. The Runthard simply leaves, trailing his remaining captives behind him, and the Commissar is left alone in a press of human bodies that includes soldiers, civilians, and, judging by the remnants of their clothing, individuals from 6 different regiments and planetary populations. The other prisoners regard the Commissar with a complex mixture of emotions. Some look at him with hope, the instinctive response of the faithful to the presence of Imperial authority. If a Commissar is here, surely the Emperor has not forgotten them. Surely rescue is coming. Surely someone is doing something. Others look at him with something closer to resentment, that bitter, unspoken accusation that hangs in the air of every prisoner of war camp. You were supposed to protect us. Yet you were supposed to lead us to victory. You failed. And a few, the ones who have been here the longest, the ones whose eyes have gone flat and whose spirits have been ground down by weeks or months of captivity, look at the Commissar with an expression that is worst of all. They look at him with pity, because they know what he does not yet know. They know what the Orks have planned for him. They know that the peaked cap and the greatcoat and the bolt pistol and all the authority they represent mean absolutely nothing in this place. Here, there is only one authority, and it belongs to the biggest, meanest, greenest thing in the room, and compared to the Orks, every human in this camp is very, very small. The first days in the slave pens establish a pattern that will define the Commissar's captivity, a pattern of brutality, deprivation, and a peculiar kind of Orkish attention that is somehow worse than being ignored entirely. The mornings, such as they are in a place where the concept of time has been reduced to the crude rhythm of orc activity. Begin with the arrival of the Gretchen overseers. These small, wiry creatures, standing perhaps 4 feet tall with large, bat-like ears and cunning, malicious eyes, are the day-to-day administrators of the slave population. The orcs themselves cannot be bothered with the tedious work of managing captives, so the task falls to the Gretchen, who approach it with a sadistic enthusiasm that belies their diminutive stature. The Gretchen overseers carry crude whips and electrified prods, and they use both with liberal abandon. But their job is to sort the captives into work details and ensure that those details are carried out to whatever standard their orc masters have demanded, a standard that is typically impossible to meet, and that therefore provides the Gretchen with an endless excuse for punishment. The work itself varies depending on the needs of the warband. Some captives are sent to the quarries, where they break rocks with crude tools to produce building materials for the constantly expanding orc settlement. Others are dispatched to the ammunition workshops, where they perform the dangerous and delicate work of filling shell casings with the volatile propellants that orcs favor, crude mixtures of chemicals that are as likely to explode in the worker's hands as in the enemy's face. Still others are assigned to the most degrading task of all, sanitation duty, which involves cleaning the vast and unspeakable waste pits that the orcs produce on a daily basis. The Commissar's status as a high-ranking Imperial officer does not exempt him from this labor. If anything, it makes things worse because the Gretchen take particular pleasure in humiliating captives who once held positions of power. They make a point of assigning the Commissar to the most unpleasant tasks, of singling him out for extra punishment, of mocking him in their high-pitched, cackling language. One Gretchen in particular, a specimen of unusual size and cruelty, who has appointed himself the primary overseer of the human section, develops an obsessive focus on the Commissar, and he has somehow learned that the peaked cap and the greatcoat signify authority among humans, and he delights in forcing the Commissar to perform menial tasks while wearing them, turning the symbols of imperial dignity into props in a performance of degradation. But the Commissar endures. This is what he was trained to do. The Schola Progenium did not produce men who break under hardship, and the years of service that followed have only strengthened the iron core that was forged in those classrooms and training grounds. He works when ordered to work. He bears the blows of the Gretchen overseers without complaint. He conserves his strength, watches for opportunities, and, most importantly, he maintains the bearing of a Commissar even in captivity. His back remains straight. His gaze remains level. His voice, when he speaks, carries the same authority it always has, even if the audience is now a huddle of broken prisoners rather than a regiment of soldiers. This last point is important, because the other captives are watching. They are watching to see if the Commissar will break, if the symbol of imperial authority will crumble under the weight of orc captivity, the way so many others have crumbled before. And when he does not break, when he continues to carry himself like a Commissar even in chains, something remarkable begins to happen. The other prisoners start to rally around him, not in any overt way, not in any way that might attract the attention of their captors, but in small, quiet acts of solidarity that speak to the enduring power of the human spirit. An extra scrap of food passed from hand to hand until it reaches the Commissar. A warning whispered when the Gretchen overseers are in a particularly foul mood. A hand extended to help him up when the labor becomes too much. The Commissar recognizes these gestures for what they are, the beginnings of a resistance, however small, however futile, and he begins, carefully and quietly, to organize it. He identifies the strongest captives, the ones who still have some fight left in them. He learns the layout of the camp, the schedules of the guards, the locations of the weapon stores. He begins to build, in his mind, if not yet in reality, the skeleton of a plan. But the orcs have plans of their own, and those plans are about to make everything much, much worse. The odd boys are the specialists of orc society, individuals who are born with specific knowledge and aptitudes genetically encoded in their DNA. Where most orcs are content to simply fight and eat, and fight some more, The Odd Boys develop skills that allow Orc civilization to function at a level far above what their crude appearance might suggest. Mech Boys build machines and weapons. Pain Boys practice surgery and medicine, though calling what they do medicine is a generous interpretation. Weird Boys channel the psychic energy of the Orc Gestalt field into devastating attacks, and Runthirds manage the slave populations that keep the whole ramshackle enterprise running. It is the Pain Boys who take the most immediate and alarming interest in our captured Commissar, and their interest has nothing to do with his health or well-being. Pain Boys, also known as Mad Docs, are the doctors and surgeons of Orc society. They possess an instinctive understanding of anatomy and biological systems that allows them to perform operations and procedures that would be considered impossible by the medical standards of any other species. They can reattach severed limbs, replace damaged organs, transplant heads between different bodies, and graft mechanical augmentations onto living flesh with a success rate that is frankly astonishing given the crude conditions in which they operate. The key word here, however, is success rate. Pain Boys operate without anesthetic because keeping the patient conscious is the only reliable way to confirm that the patient is still alive. Their tools are crude, improvised instruments that would not look out of place in a medieval torture chamber. Their understanding of sterile procedure is non-existent, and their primary motivation is not the well-being of their patient, but the satisfaction of their own insatiable curiosity. Because above all else, Pain Boys love to experiment. They call it experimenting, and it is the driving passion of their lives. Every new species, every new type of creature that falls into their hands represents an opportunity to poke and prod and cut and reassemble in ways that might produce interesting results. Some of these experiments have practical applications, like the creation of cyborgs, Orks, who have been augmented with mechanical parts to increase their combat effectiveness. Others are purely academic, driven by nothing more than the Pain Boys' desire to see what happens when you swap a human's arm with a squig's tentacle or replace someone's blood with promethium. The most ambitious Pain Boys, the ones who hold the elevated rank of Pain Boss, have been known to attempt even more audacious projects. Some have tried to capture space marines in order to study their gene seed and engineer a strain of even hardier Orks. Others have experimented with cross-species grafting, attempting to combine the biological advantages of different species into a single organism. The results of these experiments are almost invariably horrifying, producing screaming, thrashing monstrosities that exist in constant agony until the merciful failure of their jury-rigged biological systems finally kills them. Our Commissar attracts the attention of the camp's resident Pain Boy almost immediately. The Pain Boy, was a particularly large and enthusiastic specimen with arms stained green and red up to the elbows and a collection of surgical instruments that could double as museum exhibits on the history of human cruelty, has been getting bored with his usual patients. Orc physiology, while endlessly resilient, is also endlessly familiar. He has operated on thousands of Orcs over his career, and while there is always some novelty to be found in the unique way each patient screams, the fundamental biology is always the same. Human captives, by contrast, are fascinating. Their bodies are fragile and complex, filled with organs that serve purposes the Pain Boy can only guess at, and systems that interact in ways that his instinctive knowledge of Orc biology does not equip him to understand. The Commissar is a particularly interesting specimen because of his physical condition. Years of augmetic enhancement, the kind of minor but significant modifications that high-ranking Imperial officers receive as a matter of course, have left traces in his body that the Pain Boy's keen eyes do not miss. There are microsutures from old surgeries, traces of rejuvenate treatments that have slowed the aging process, a small cranial implant that enhances memory and cognitive function. To the Pain Boy, these are not the marks of civilized medicine. They are tantalizing hints of a technology he does not fully understand, clues to a biological puzzle that he is burning to solve. The first examination takes place in the Pain Boy's workshop. as a tent of stitched-together hides and scrap metal that smells like an abattoir and looks like something from a particularly disturbing nightmare. The Commissar is dragged from the slave pens by a pair of massive orc orderlies and deposited on a table that is still slick with fluids from the pain boy's last patient. The pain boy circles him, poking and prodding with fingers that are surprisingly dexterous despite their size, muttering to himself in a language that the Commissar cannot understand, but that somehow conveys a sense of delighted anticipation that turns his stomach. The pain boy discovers the cranial implant first, and his reaction is something between scientific excitement and childlike glee. He has never seen anything like it. He knows on an instinctive level that it does something to the brain, that it enhances or modifies the functions of the organ in some way, but the specifics elude him, and this is unacceptable. He wants to understand. He needs to understand. And the only way to understand, in the pain boy's methodology, is to take things apart and see how they work. What follows is not quite surgery and not quite torture, but something that occupies a horrible middle ground between the two. The pain boy does not remove the implant. That would destroy it, and he wants to study it in place. Instead, he probes around it, cutting small incisions in the Commissar's scalp and inserting crude instruments that scrape against bone and send white-hot bolts of pain shooting through the human's nervous system. The Commissar does not scream. He bites through his own lip and tastes blood and does not scream. Or because he is a Commissar, and Commissars do not give the enemy the satisfaction. The pain boy notices this and is impressed in his own crude way. He has never had a patient who did not scream. He makes a mental note to explore this anomaly further at a later date. The examination lasts for what feels like hours, but is probably less than one. When it is over, the pain boy has not done any permanent damage, at least not by his standards, though the Commissar's head feels like it has been used as an anvil, and the crude stitches holding his scalp together itch with the promise of infection. He is returned to the slave pens with a collection of new wounds and a growing understanding of just how much worse his situation can get. Because the pain boy is not done with him. The pain boy has barely begun. The mech boys, meanwhile, have their own reasons for interest in the Commissar, though their attention is focused not on the man himself, but on the equipment he was carrying when he was captured. A Commissar's standard equipment, his bolt pistol, his chainsword, his flak armor, his personal Vox unit, represents a treasure trove of Imperial technology that any self-respecting mech boy would give his right arm to study. And since orc arms can be reattached, this is less of a sacrifice than it might sound. The bolt pistol in particular draws intense interest. Bolt weapons are among the most sophisticated small arms in the Imperial arsenal, firing miniature rocket-propelled rounds that detonate on impact with devastating effect. To a mech boy, whose understanding of ballistics is entirely instinctive, a bolt pistol is both a puzzle and an inspiration. Yet he cannot replicate it, not exactly, because the precision engineering required to manufacture bolt ammunition is beyond even the most skilled orc mech. But he can study it, learn from it, incorporate its principles into his own creations. A custom shooter built with insights gleaned from a bolt pistol might be marginally more accurate, marginally more powerful, marginally more likely to hit what it is aimed at rather than everything else in the general vicinity. In the marginal world of orc engineering, where every slight improvement is a competitive advantage, this is significant. The chainsword receives similar treatment, though with more straightforward results. Orcs already use chain-bladed weapons, their crude choppers sometimes incorporating motor-driven teeth that serve a similar function. But the Imperial chainsword is a refined version of this concept. Its diamond-tipped teeth and perfectly balanced weight distribution representing centuries of human engineering excellence. The mech boy who gets his hands on it will spend hours taking it apart, studying each component, and then reassembling it in a form that is recognizably orc, which is to say, louder, heavier, less reliable, but somehow more dangerous in ways that defy rational explanation. But the most valuable piece of equipment, the one that would make the Commissar's captors wealthy beyond the dreams of orc avarice if they understood its full significance, is the personal Vox unit. Imperial communications technology is one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, and a working Vox unit in Ork hands represents a potential intelligence bonanza. The frequencies, the encryption protocols, the communication procedures, all of these could be used to intercept Imperial transmissions, to sow confusion among Imperial forces, to turn the Imperium's own communications network against it. The irony is that most Ork mech boys would not understand this. They would see the Vox unit as just another piece of interesting technology, something to be taken apart and reassembled in ways that might make it louder or more entertaining, but that would utterly destroy its value as an intelligence asset. A blood axe mech boy, one of those rare Orks who has been influenced by exposure to human military culture and who understands the concept of military intelligence, might appreciate the Vox unit's true significance. But among the rank-and-file Ork clans, it would be just another piece of loot. Still, the Commissar does not know this. As far as he knows, every piece of information that was stored on his person, every code, every frequency, every tactical assessment, is now in enemy hands. And while enemy hands in this case belong to creatures who are unlikely to use that information in any coordinated fashion, the possibility remains. The Commissar's training demands that he assume the worst, that he consider himself a compromised asset, that he act on the assumption that everything he knows is now known by the enemy. This realization adds a new dimension to his captivity. It is no longer simply a matter of personal survival. It is a matter of damage control. He needs to escape, not just for his own sake, but to warn Imperial forces that their communications may be compromised, that their tactical dispositions may have been revealed, but that the enemy may know things that it should not know. The urgency of this mission wars with the reality of his situation, which is that he is chained to a stake in a slave pen, surrounded by millions of the most aggressive aliens in the galaxy, and the closest thing to a friendly face is a Gretchen who takes particular pleasure in whipping him. But the Commissar has faced impossible odds before. He has stood on the walls of falling fortresses and dared the enemy to come. He has rallied broken regiments with nothing but the force of his voice and the fire of his faith. He has done things that lesser men said could not be done, survived situations that lesser men said could not be survived. He will find a way. He must find a way, because the alternative is not just his own death, but the death of the Imperium's ability to fight on this front, and that is something that no Commissar, no servant of the God Emperor, can accept. The Ork fighting pits are one of those cultural institutions that the Imperium's xenologists study with a mixture of academic fascination and visceral horror. They are exactly what they sound like. Crude arenas, usually nothing more than large holes dug in the ground and surrounded by walls of packed earth or scrap metal, where Orks gather to watch various forms of combat for entertainment. Fighting pits serve multiple functions in Ork society. They are a form of dispute resolution, where disagreements between individual Orks or rival mobs can be settled through direct combat rather than escalating into full-scale warfare. They are a training ground, but where younger Orks can hone their fighting skills against opponents in a relatively controlled environment. They are entertainment, pure and simple, a spectacle that draws crowds of whooping, hollering greenskins who bet their teeth on the outcomes and hurl crude food at combatants who fail to provide sufficient bloodshed. And, most relevantly for our story, they are a venue for the exhibition of captured enemies. Orks love to watch things fight. It is, in many ways, the closest thing they have to art or culture in the way that other species understand those concepts. A good fight in the pits, one that goes on for a long time and involves a lot of blood and a dramatic finish, is celebrated and remembered in Ork oral tradition for years afterward. The best fighters, both Ork and otherwise, become something like celebrities within the warband, their names known and their exploits discussed with the same passionate attention that humans might devote to sports heroes or military legends. Human captives are regularly thrown into the fighting pits, though their survival rates are, predictably, poor. A normal human, even a trained Imperial guardsman, is simply outmatched by an orc in every physical dimension. The average orc boy stands around 7 feet tall and weighs several hundred pounds, nearly all of it muscle. His skin is tough enough to serve as natural armor, capable of deflecting blows that would crack human bone. His reflexes, despite his lumbering appearance, are surprisingly quick, and his pain tolerance is so high that injuries that would incapacitate a human barely slow him down. Putting a human in the pit against an orc is less a fight and more an execution with extra steps. But the orcs have developed several ways to make the spectacle more interesting. Sometimes human captives are pitted against each other, which removes the physical mismatch and allows the orcs to study human combat techniques with the same detached interest that a human might bring to watching two exotic animals fight. Sometimes captives are given crude weapons and matched against Gretchen or Snotlings, which levels the playing field somewhat and provides the additional entertainment of watching the normally cowardly little greenskins actually have to fight for their lives. And sometimes, when the orcs want a real show, a particularly promising captive is given proper weapons and matched against a series of increasingly dangerous opponents. As a gauntlet that tests the limits of the human skill and endurance and provides the crowd with a sustained spectacle that can last for hours. Our Commissar is destined for this last category, and the reason is simple. The orcs have noticed that he fights. From his very first day in captivity, the Commissar has been unable to completely suppress the fighting instincts that decades of training and combat have ingrained in his very being. When a Gretchen overseer pushes too hard, the Commissar pushes back. When an orc reaches for him, the Commissar's body moves with the practiced efficiency of a man who has spent his entire adult life in combat, deflecting the grab or rolling away from the blow. He does not win these encounters, obviously. He cannot win them, not against creatures that outweigh him by a factor of 3 or more. But he fights, and in the orc universe, fighting is the only currency that matters. The knob who runs the fighting pits, a massive greenskin covered in scars and crude tattoos, who goes by the name of Gut Basher, hears about the fighting human from the Runthird, who oversees the slave pens. Gut Basher is always on the lookout for new attractions, new ways to fill his pits with spectacles that will draw crowds and generate the teeth that keep him in power. A human who fights back is a rarity. A human who fights back and is also clearly some kind of leader among his own species is even rarer. Gut Basher sees opportunity, and in orc society, opportunity is seized with both fists. The Commissar's first appearance in the fighting pits is stage-managed with a degree of showmanship that would be impressive if it were not so deeply disturbing. He is brought to the arena in chains, flanked by 2 massive orc guards who shove him through the entrance and into the pit with enthusiastic force. The crowd, a dense mass of greenskins that fills the terraced seating around the pit's rim, roars its approval. They have heard about the fighting human, the one in the fancy coat, and they want to see what he can do. The pit itself is roughly circular, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, with walls of packed earth reinforced with scrap metal that rise about 4 meters to the level of the spectators. The floor is sandy, stained dark in places with the blood of previous combatants. Crude weapons are scattered around the edges, some of them Imperial issue, and some of them orc manufacture. Is all of them deliberately dulled or damaged to ensure that the fights last longer and the entertainment value is maximized. The Commissar's first opponent is another human, a once powerful man who has been reduced by weeks of captivity to a gaunt, hollow-eyed shadow of his former self. The man was a soldier once, judging by the faded tattoos on his arms and the way he holds the crude club he has been given. But the orcs have broken something in him that no amount of muscle memory can repair. He attacks the Commissar with a desperate, flailing energy that has more in common with panic than with martial skill, and the Commissar, moving with the controlled precision of a man who has trained in close combat since childhood, disarms him in 3 moves and puts him on the ground without causing serious injury. The crowd is pleased, but not satisfied. They want blood, and they do not particularly care whose. When the Commissar refuses to deliver a killing blow to his fallen opponent, instead stepping back and standing at attention in a gesture of defiance that is clearly directed at the watching orcs, the crowd's pleasure turns to irritation. An orc at the edge of the pit hurls a half-eaten squig at the Commissar's head. Another throws a rock. The message is clear. In the fighting pits, mercy is not an option. Gutbasher, watching from a platform above the pit that serves as a kind of royal box, makes a decision. The Commissar clearly has skill, and skill is valuable, but he also has spirit, and spirit, in Gutbasher's experience, is what makes a truly great fighter. The key is to channel that spirit in the right direction, as to give the human opponents worthy of his abilities and situations that force him to fight at his absolute best. The crowd will love it. The teeth will flow, and Gutbasher will be the knob who discovered the greatest pit fighter in the camp's history. What follows over the coming weeks is a grim progression of escalating combat that strips away the Commissar's civilized restraint layer by layer and forces him to confront the most primal aspects of his own nature. The opponents get bigger, the weapons get cruder, the stakes get higher. He fights other humans, some of them former allies, and is forced to hurt them badly enough to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust without killing them. A balancing act that requires a level of control that most fighters cannot maintain under such extreme stress. He fights Gretchen, a quick and nasty little creatures who compensate for their lack of strength with vicious cunning and a willingness to fight dirty that makes them genuinely dangerous in the confined space of the pit. He fights captured aliens, creatures whose combat styles are utterly unfamiliar to him and who force him to adapt on the fly, relying on his general combat training rather than specific techniques. And then, inevitably, they put him in the pit against an orc. The crowd has been building toward this moment for weeks, and the atmosphere on the day of the fight is electric. Every orc in the camp who can get away from their duties has gathered at the fighting pits, and those who cannot have sent Gretchen to save them seats. Gutbasher has been promoting the fight with all the crude showmanship at his disposal, spreading the word that his prized human fighter will be tested against a real opponent at last. Bets have been placed. Teeth have been wagered. The anticipation is palpable, that buzzing psychic energy that suffuses every orc gathering, ramped up to a level that makes the air itself feel thick and charged. The orc that enters the pit is a boy, not a knob, because even Gutbasher is not foolish enough to pit a human against a fully grown orc leader. But even a standard orc boy is a formidable opponent for any human. A 7-foot wall of green muscle armed with a crude chopper and the kind of enthusiasm for violence that comes from being a member of a species that was literally designed for combat. The Commissar is given a choice of weapons. He selects a length of metal pipe, roughly the weight and balance of a long sword, and a scavenged piece of armor plating that he can use as a makeshift shield. These are not ideal weapons, but they are what is available, and the Commissar is experienced enough to know that in a fight like this, the weapon matters less than the mind that wields it. The fight begins when the orc charges. This is what orcs do. They charge. They run headlong at their opponent with all the subtlety of a freight train, closing the distance as quickly as possible so they can get into the close quarters combat where their physical superiority is most pronounced. It is a strategy that works brilliantly against most opponents, because most opponents are not expecting something that large to move that fast. And the psychological impact of having a 300-pound green monster bearing down on you at full sprint is usually enough to freeze even experienced soldiers in place. The Commissar does not freeze. He sidesteps. The pipe comes around in a whistling arc that catches the orc across the back of the head as it thunders past, a blow that would have cracked a human skull like an egg, but that merely staggers the greenskin and sends it stumbling into the far wall of the pit. The crowd roars, delighted. Blood has been drawn. The fight is on. What follows is not a display of martial elegance. It is a brutal, grinding, ugly fight in which the Commissar uses every dirty trick, every desperate technique, every ounce of cunning he possesses to stay alive against an opponent who outweighs him by a factor of 3 and can absorb punishment that would kill a normal human several times over. He keeps moving, never staying in one place long enough for the orc to get a solid grip on him. He targets weak points, the eyes, the throat, the joints, places where even orc physiology offers less protection. He uses the terrain, the walls, and the scattered debris of the pit to break up the orc's charges and create opportunities for counterattacks. He takes hits, because taking hits is unavoidable against an orc, but he rolls with them, absorbs the impact, and keeps fighting. The orc, for its part, is having the time of its life. This is what orcs exist for. This is the purpose that burns in the blood of every greenskin, down from the smallest snotling to the mightiest warboss. The human is fast and tricky and refuses to go down, and every time the orc thinks it has cornered its prey, the human slips away and comes back with another stinging blow to a sensitive spot. It is frustrating and painful, and absolutely wonderful. The orc is grinning from ear to ear, its massive jaws stretched wide in an expression of pure, unadulterated joy. The fight lasts far longer than anyone expected. The Commissar cannot win, he knows that. Everyone watching knows that. But he can endure, and endurance is its own form of victory. By the time the orc finally manages to land a solid blow that sends the human crashing to the ground, the Commissar has been fighting for nearly 20 minutes, an eternity by the standards of the pit. He lies on the sandy floor, his vision swimming. In his body, a landscape of bruises and cuts, and waits for the killing blow that he knows is coming. But it does not come. The orc stands over him, chopper raised, blood dripping from a dozen small wounds that the Commissar managed to inflict over the course of the fight. It looks down at the broken human at its feet and makes a sound that the Commissar has never heard before, a sound that he will later come to recognize as the orcish equivalent of applause. The crowd is on its feet, stomping and roaring and bellowing their approval. The human fought well. The human showed spirit. The human earned the right to live, at least for today, at least until the next fight. Gutbasher, up on his platform, is counting the teeth that have poured in from the betting and cackling with glee. He has found his attraction, his star, his meal ticket. The fighting human in the fancy coat is going to make him very rich indeed. The Commissar is dragged from the pit and deposited back in the slave pens. He is given food and water for the first time in days, crude orc rations that taste like cardboard, soaked in motor oil, but that provide the nutrients his battered body desperately needs. The other captives tend to his wounds as best they can, using strips torn from their own clothing as bandages and applying what rudimentary first aid their limited supplies allow. And the Commissar lies there in the dirt, staring up at the smoke-stained sky through the gaps in the scrap metal roof of the slave pen, and thinks about what has just happened. He has fought for the entertainment of aliens. He has been forced to perform like an animal in a cage, dancing for the amusement of creatures who view him as less than nothing. Every principle he was raised to uphold, every tenet of the imperial creed that defines his existence, has been violated in the most fundamental way possible. But he is alive, and as long as he is alive, as long as breath enters his lungs and blood moves through his veins, he remains what he has always been, a Commissar, a servant of the God Emperor, a man with a duty that transcends his own comfort, his own dignity, and even his own survival. The orcs think they have captured a pet. They think they have found a new toy to play with. They do not understand that what they have actually done is given an Imperial Commissar something that he did not have before. They have given him a reason to keep fighting. As understanding the cultural differences between the various orc clans is essential to grasping how our Commissar's captivity would vary depending on which particular flavor of greenskin has taken him. The 6 major orc clans, the Goths, the Bad Moons, the Evil Suns, the Blood Axes, the Death Skulls, and the Snakebites, each have their own distinct cultural identity, their own preferences and values, their own approach to warfare, and, by extension, their own approach to prisoners. A commissar who falls into the hands of a blood axe warband will have a very different experience than one captured by the Goths, and understanding these differences helps us paint a more complete picture of the nightmare that awaits. Let us begin with the Goths, because they are the simplest and in many ways the most terrifying. But the Goths are the largest and most aggressive of the Orc clans. They are the purists of Orc society, the greenskins who embody the fundamental Orc values of strength, aggression, and combat prowess in their most distilled form. Goths dress in black, often with white and black checkered patterns, and they favor close combat above all other forms of warfare. They are the clan that produces the greatest number of war bosses, because the biggest and meanest Orcs tend to be Goths, and their mobs are legendary for the sheer volume of infantry they can field. Gazkul Thraka, the most powerful Orc warboss in the galaxy and the self-proclaimed prophet of the Great Crusade, is a Goth. This tells you everything you need to know about the clan's character. And a Commissar captured by Goths can expect a captivity that is straightforward in its brutality. The Goths do not have the patience or the inclination for the kind of elaborate cruelty that some other factions might inflict. They will not torture the Commissar for information, because information is not something Goths particularly value. They will not experiment on him, because experimentation requires a level of intellectual curiosity that most Goths regard with suspicion. What they will do is throw him into the fighting pits at the earliest opportunity and watch him fight until he can fight no more. For the Goths, combat is the only measure of worth, the only thing that matters, the only thing that is truly real. A prisoner who can fight is a prisoner who has value. A prisoner who cannot fight is a prisoner who has no reason to exist. There is a crude honesty to this approach that is, in its own terrible way, almost respectful. The Goths do not hate their captives. They do not despise them or wish to degrade them for the sake of degradation. They simply want to see them fight, and they will provide the opportunity for that fight with an enthusiasm that borders on the generous. The best weapons, the most exciting opponents, the largest crowds. All of these will be provided for a fighter who has earned the Goths' respect. The problem, of course, is that Goth respect is measured in blood, and the fights never stop until the fighter does. The Bad Moons offer a very different experience, one that is in some ways worse because it is more personalized. The Bad Moons are the wealthiest of the Orc clans, their teeth growing faster than those of any other greenskin, and providing them with a steady income that makes them the envy of Orc society. Bad Moons are flashy, ostentatious, and obsessed with showing off their wealth. They favor the biggest guns, the shiniest armor, the most elaborately decorated vehicles, and they view the accumulation and display of material goods as an end in itself. A Commissar captured by Bad Moons will be treated not as a fighter, but as a trophy. The peaked cap, the greatcoat, the bolt pistol, all of these symbols of imperial authority become prestige items in the Bad Moon economy. The Commissar himself becomes a living decoration, a piece of the warboss's collection that demonstrates both his prowess in battle, because he captured a human leader and his wealth, because he can afford to keep a prisoner instead of putting him to work. He will be paraded before other Orcs, displayed at gatherings and feasts, forced to perform tricks or recite imperial catechisms for the amusement of his captors. The degradation here is more insidious than the Goths' straightforward brutality. It is a slow, systematic stripping away of dignity, a process of reduction from person to object that attacks the Commissar's sense of self in ways that physical violence alone cannot achieve. The Bad Moons do not want to break his body. They want to break his spirit, to turn the fearsome representative of the God Emperor into a pathetic, amusing curiosity that demonstrates the superiority of Orc wealth and power over human authority. The Evil Sons, a speed-obsessed maniacs who believe that going fast is the highest form of existence, would treat a captured Commissar primarily as a passenger, or, more accurately, as a test subject for their increasingly insane vehicles. The evil sons love nothing more than strapping something onto one of their ramshackle vehicles and seeing how fast they can go before something breaks. And a screaming human tied to the front of a war buggy adds an extra dimension of entertainment to the proceedings. The Commissar would spend most of his captivity in a state of absolute terror, hurtling across the landscape at speeds that no Ork vehicle has any right to achieve, dodging obstacles and praying to the Emperor that the crude engine mounted inches from his body does not decide to explode. It is a uniquely evil son's form of torture, and in that the Orks do not see it as torture at all. They see it as a good time, and they cannot understand why the human keeps screaming. The Death Skulls, those inveterate thieves and looters who will steal anything that is not nailed down and then come back with a pry bar for whatever is, would strip the Commissar of everything he possesses within minutes of his capture, and then argue among themselves about who gets what. The greatcoat, the cap, the bolt pistol, the chainsword, even the buttons on his uniform, would all be claimed by individual Death Skulls as personal trophies. The Commissar himself would be regarded with diminishing interest once his possessions had been distributed, relegated to the slave pens to be put to work alongside the other captives. Death Skull captivity is, in many ways, the most mundane of the options, lacking the dramatic horror of the other clans, but replacing it with a soul-crushing tedium that can break a man just as surely as any torturer's rack. The snakebites, the most traditionalist and primitive of the Ork clans, would treat the Commissar much as they treat all non-Ork creatures, with a rough animal handler's pragmatism. The snakebites favor beasts over machines, riding great squiggoths into battle and breeding attack. Squigs with the same care that a human nobleman might breed war horses. A captured Commissar would be viewed as just another animal to be tamed and trained, his defiance interpreted not as moral courage, but as the instinctive resistance of a wild creature that has not yet learned its place. But the snakebite Rundhards would apply their beast-handling techniques to the human captive with predictable results. A lot of pain, a lot of resistance, and an eventual, grudging equilibrium in which the Commissar learns to perform basic tasks in exchange for food and water, while the snakebites congratulate themselves on having successfully domesticated a particularly stubborn species of prey animal. But it is the blood axes who offer the most complex and, in many ways, the most dangerous experience for a captured Commissar. The blood axes are unique among Ork clans in that they have been significantly influenced by exposure to human military culture. They were the first Ork clan to encounter the Imperium, and that encounter left lasting marks on their approach to warfare. Blood axes use camouflage, though they do not always understand how it works, and often apply jungle patterns to desert environments, or vice versa. They employ tactical concepts like flanking maneuvers, feigned retreats, and intelligence gathering. They have been known to trade with human settlements, to hire themselves out as mercenaries for imperial forces, and to engage in diplomatic negotiations with enemies before, during, and after battles. Other Ork clans regard the blood axes with deep suspicion, calling them treacherous, cowardly, and the worst insult in the Ork vocabulary, un-Orky. The blood axes take these insults in stride, secure in the knowledge that their approach to warfare produces results, and that their clan has a legacy of leadership and conquest that speaks for itself. A Commissar captured by blood axes would face a situation that is, as paradoxically, both more hopeful and more dangerous than any other form of Ork captivity. More hopeful because the blood axes, alone among Ork clans, might actually recognize the Commissar's value as an intelligence asset, rather than simply a trophy or a pit fighter. A blood axe warboss with sufficient cunning might attempt to extract information from the Commissar about imperial force dispositions, communication protocols, tactical doctrines, all the things that a conventional enemy would want to know from a captured officer. But it is more dangerous for exactly the same reason. A blood axe warboss who understands the concept of intelligence gathering also understands the concept of interrogation, and Ork interrogation techniques, even when informed by a rudimentary understanding of human psychology, are not gentle. Moreover, the blood axes might attempt to use the Commissar as a tool of psychological warfare, parading him before Imperial forces to demoralize them, broadcasting his captured status on Imperial communication frequencies, or even attempting to turn him into a collaborator who can assist the Orks in understanding and exploiting human weaknesses. This last possibility, collaboration, is the nightmare scenario that the Commissariat trains its officers to resist above all others. A Commissar who turns traitor is not merely a personal failure. He is a catastrophe on a strategic level because his knowledge of Imperial command structures, tactical doctrines, and communication procedures could be used to devastate Imperial operations across an entire sector. The Blood Axes, with their understanding of human military culture, are the one Orc clan that might be capable of understanding this and exploiting it. Our Commissar would resist, of course. He has been trained to resist. His entire identity is built on the foundation of his loyalty to the Emperor, and no amount of Orc persuasion, whether brutal or cunning, can shake that foundation. But resistance comes at a cost, and the cost, in an Orc camp, surrounded by enemies who view his suffering as entertainment, is paid in blood and pain and the slow, relentless erosion of hope. But let us speak now of the psychological dimension of the Commissar's captivity, because the physical horrors, as terrible as they are, may not be the worst thing that he endures. A Commissar is trained to be unbreakable. The Schola Progenium does not produce men who waver in the face of adversity. It produces men of iron conviction, an absolute faith, and unshakable determination. These qualities have served our Commissar well throughout his career. They have allowed him to stand firm when others faltered, to make impossible decisions without hesitation, to send men to their deaths with the calm certainty that their sacrifice served a greater purpose. But captivity attacks these qualities in ways that combat does not. In combat, the Commissar has agency. He can fight, he can lead, he can influence the outcome of events through the application of his skill and his will. In captivity, he has none of these things. He is powerless, and for a man whose entire identity is built on the exercise of power, of authority, of the right and the duty to command, powerlessness is a form of torment that no physical pain can match. The first enemy is isolation. Not physical isolation, since the slave pens are crowded to the point of suffocation, but spiritual and emotional isolation. The Commissar is cut off from everything that gives his life meaning. The regiment he served is gone, scattered or destroyed on the battlefield where he was captured. The chain of command he was part of has continued without him, his duties reassigned, his reports left unwritten, his authority transferred to another. The Emperor's light, that comforting certainty that sustains every faithful servant of the Imperium through the darkest hours, feels impossibly distant in this place of green skin and crude iron. The Commissar prays, of course. He prays every day, mouthing the catechisms he learned in childhood with a fervor that grows more desperate with each passing week. But the Emperor, if he hears, does not answer. And in the silence between the prayers, doubt begins to whisper. This is the cruelest irony of the Commissar's situation. He has spent his career executing men who showed doubt. He has put bolt rounds through the heads of soldiers who questioned the Emperor's plan, who faltered in their faith, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the Imperium's eternal war was not worth the price it demanded. He has done this without hesitation and without remorse, because doubt is the enemy of discipline, and discipline is the foundation upon which the Imperium stands. And now, in the darkness of an Orc slave pen, with the taste of blood in his mouth and the sound of greenskin laughter in his ears, doubt comes for him. It does not come as a grand theological crisis. It does not announce itself with trumpets and dramatic revelation. Whilst it comes quietly, in the small hours when sleep will not come, and the mind turns in on itself like a trapped animal gnawing at its own leg. It comes in the form of questions that he cannot answer. Where is the Emperor's protection? If the God Emperor watches over his faithful, why is this faithful servant in chains? If the Commissar's duty was sacred and his purpose divine, why has that purpose led him to this place of degradation and suffering? The Commissar fights these questions with everything he has. He reminds himself that faith is not conditional, that the Emperor's plan is vast beyond mortal comprehension, that suffering is the crucible in which the worthy are tested and the unworthy are consumed. He recites the litanies of fortitude, the prayers of endurance, the catechisms that address this very scenario. And because the Schola Progenium anticipated that some of its graduates would face captivity and built theological defenses against the despair that captivity brings. But the litanies were written by men who had never been where he is. The prayers were composed by scholars who understood suffering in the abstract, not in the intimate, grinding, day-after-day reality of being property. The catechisms address captivity as a temporary trial, a dark night of the soul that ends in either glorious rescue or martyrdom's embrace. They do not address what happens when the trial goes on and on and on, when rescue does not come, when martyrdom is not offered, when the only options are to endure or to break. The Orks are unwitting accomplices in this psychological assault, as because the very nature of their culture ensures that the Commissar is constantly exposed to stimuli that reinforce his sense of helplessness. The noise, the violence, the casual brutality, the total absence of anything resembling human dignity or order. All of these things work on the psyche like sandpaper, wearing away the surfaces of sanity, one thin layer at a time. The Commissar does not have the luxury of solitude, of quiet contemplation, of the mental space required to process his experiences and maintain his equilibrium. He is bombarded, ceaselessly and relentlessly, by a world that makes no sense and offers no refuge. And there is the issue of time. In the Imperium, time has structure. There are schedules and routines, watches and shifts, holy days and feast days, and the endless, as comforting rhythm of ritual that gives shape to the passage of hours and days and years. In the Ork camp, time is a formless thing, measured only by the rise and fall of the sun, and sometimes not even that, since the smoke from the camp's fires and forges can obscure the sky for days at a time. The Commissar has no way to track the passage of time with any accuracy. He does not know if he has been in captivity for weeks or months. He does not know if the Imperium is still fighting for this world, or if it has been abandoned. He does not know if anyone is coming for him, or if anyone even knows he is still alive. This uncertainty is, in many ways, worse than knowing the worst. If the Commissar knew that no rescue was coming, he could adapt his plans accordingly. If he knew that Imperial forces were mounting a counterattack, he could focus his energy on survival and readiness, but he knows neither, and the uncertainty itself becomes a form of torture, an endless, gnawing anxiety that prevents him from resting, from planning, from finding any kind of equilibrium in his terrible new circumstances. The other prisoners notice the toll that captivity takes on the Commissar, and their reactions are mixed. Some are encouraged by his continued resistance, drawing strength from his refusal to submit, even as they themselves have long since given up hope. Others are disturbed by the cracks they see forming in his composure, the moments when the iron mask slips and something raw and desperate shows through. A few, the ones who have been broken most completely, actively resent his refusal to accept the reality of their situation. To them, the Commissar's resistance is not courage, but delusion, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge what they have been forced to accept, that they are never going home, that the Emperor has forgotten them, that hope is a luxury they can no longer afford. The Commissar is aware of these dynamics, and he manages them with the same instinctive leadership that has characterized his entire career. He cannot afford to let the others see him falter, not because his vanity demands it, but because their survival depends on it. A group of captives without hope is a group of captives who will not escape. And escape, however unlikely, however desperate, however apparently impossible, is the only acceptable outcome. The Commissar will either escape and return to Imperial lines with whatever intelligence he has gathered during his captivity, or he will die trying. There is no third option. There can be no third option, because the alternative, spending the rest of his life as an Ork's pet, fighting in the pits and laboring in the mines and slowly losing everything that makes him who he is not something that any Commissar, any servant of the God Emperor, can accept. And so the Commissar endures. Day after day, fight after fight, degradation after degradation, he endures. He stores away every scrap of information about the camp's layout and defenses. He identifies potential allies among the captive population. He studies the routines of the guards, the schedules of the work details, the patterns of movement that might offer an opportunity for escape. He maintains his faith, his discipline, his identity, not because it is easy, but because the alternative is unthinkable. He is a Commissar. He was made for this. Now let us consider the possibilities of escape, rescue, and the grim alternatives, because no discussion of what happens when Orks capture a regional Commissar would be complete without examining how the story might end. The chances of escaping from an Ork camp are, by any rational assessment, extremely poor. The camp is surrounded by millions of Orks. The nearest Imperial forces, assuming they still exist, are likely hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, across terrain that is almost certainly crawling with greenskin patrols and wild squigs. The Commissar has no weapons, no communications equipment, no vehicle, and no reliable intelligence about the wider strategic situation. He does not speak Ork. He does not know the local geography. He is malnourished, injured, and operating under psychological conditions that would compromise the judgment of even the most experienced field agent. And yet, escape is not impossible. The Imperium's records contain a number of accounts of prisoners who successfully escaped from Ork captivity, though these accounts are rare enough to be considered remarkable exceptions rather than representative examples. The key to these successful escapes almost always involves the same basic elements: patience, observation, timing, and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk. Patience, because any escape attempt that is launched prematurely is an escape attempt that fails. The Commissar must resist the urge to act until he has gathered sufficient intelligence to give himself a reasonable chance of success, a process that may take weeks or months. Observation. Because the Ork camp, despite its chaotic appearance, operates according to patterns that a trained eye can discern. The guards change shifts at predictable intervals. The work details follow established routes. The vehicle parks are left unattended during certain hours. The fighting pits draw crowds that leave other areas of the camp temporarily depleted of greenskin presence. Timing, because the window of opportunity, when it comes, will be narrow. A distraction, an Ork dispute that escalates into a brawl, a new enemy that demands the warband's attention, a storm or other natural event that reduces visibility and creates confusion. Any of these could provide the momentary lapse in security that the Commissar needs. And risk, because even with perfect planning and execution, yet the odds of success are poor and the consequences of failure are severe. An Ork who catches an escaping slave will not simply return the slave to the pens. He will make an example, and Ork examples tend to be loud, painful, and educational for everyone in the vicinity. The novella Prisoners of the Green Tide, as it is known in some circles among Imperial archivists, tells the story of a similar situation. Marcus van Venen, an Astra Militarum officer who thought he had found a quiet posting, finds himself and several hundred guardsmen taken prisoner by a greenskin war boss after the planet of Ratari falls to an Ork invasion. Forced to construct a colossal Ork effigy, a massive idol to the greenskin gods Gork and Mork, Van Venen reluctantly takes on the role of leader among the captives and begins planning a daring breakout. And the story illustrates both the possibility of escape and the incredible difficulty of achieving it. Every step of the plan is fraught with danger. Every moment of preparation carries the risk of discovery, and the margin for error is essentially zero. Our Commissar would face similar challenges, compounded by the fact that he is not merely trying to escape, but trying to do so while carrying intelligence that could be crucial to the Imperial war effort. The information he has gathered about the Ork camp, its numbers, its organization, its weapons and defenses, is potentially valuable enough to justify the risk of his life, but only if he can deliver it to someone who can use it. The escape itself, when it finally comes, would likely be triggered by an external event rather than purely internal planning. Or perhaps an Imperial counterattack reaches close enough to the Ork camp to create confusion and draw the Greenskins' attention away from their prisoners. Perhaps a dispute between rival Ork factions within the warband escalates into open fighting, creating a window of chaos that the Commissar can exploit. Perhaps a natural disaster, a storm or an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, throws the camp into disarray and provides cover for movement. Whatever the trigger, the escape would be a harrowing affair. The Commissar, accompanied by whatever captives he has managed to organize into a viable escape group, would need to navigate through the outskirts of the camp, avoid or neutralize any Ork patrols they encounter, traverse potentially hostile wilderness, and somehow make contact with Imperial forces without being recaptured or killed. And every step of this journey would be fraught with danger, and the casualty rate among the escapees would likely be high. But let us assume, for the sake of our narrative, that the Commissar succeeds. Let us assume that, against all odds, he manages to escape the Ork camp, evade pursuit, cross the wilderness, and reach Imperial lines. What happens then? The answer is not the triumphant homecoming that one might expect. The first thing that happens is debriefing. The Commissar is met not by cheering crowds or grateful commanders, but by officers of the Ordo Xenos, the branch of the Inquisition responsible for combating alien threats. These officers are professional, thorough, and deeply suspicious. And a high-ranking Imperial officer who has spent weeks or months in the captivity of a hostile alien species is not to be trusted until he has been exhaustively vetted, and the vetting process is neither quick nor pleasant. The Commissar is placed in isolation and questioned repeatedly about every aspect of his captivity. What did the Orks do to him? What did they ask him? What information did he provide, voluntarily or involuntarily? Was he subjected to any form of psychic influence? Did he encounter any evidence of chaos taint among the Ork forces? Was there any point at which he was out of conscious control of his own actions? These questions are not asked out of cruelty, though they may feel that way to a man who has just endured the worst experience of his life. They are asked because the Imperium cannot afford to take chances. A Commissar who has been mentally compromised, either by Xenos manipulation or by the psychological impact of prolonged captivity, is a Commissar who cannot be trusted to perform his duties. And the duties of a Commissar are too important, his authority too absolute, his access to sensitive information too extensive, for the Imperium to risk placing him back in a position of power without being certain that he is still the man he was before his capture. The psychological evaluation is, if anything, even more rigorous than the intelligence debriefing. The Commissar is examined by specialists trained to detect the subtle signs of mental compromise, individuals who understand the psychological effects of captivity, trauma, and prolonged exposure to hostile environments. They look for signs of Stockholm Syndrome, as of psychological conditioning, of the kind of deep, fundamental changes in personality and worldview that extreme stress can produce. They look for evidence that the Commissar's faith has been shaken, that his loyalty has been compromised, that his judgment has been impaired. And here is the terrible truth that the Commissar must face. Even if he passes every test, even if the Inquisition clears him of all suspicion, even if he is returned to active duty with full rank and authority, things will never be quite the same. The other Commissars will look at him differently. The soldiers under his command will whisper about his time with the Orks, wondering what happened to him, wondering what he saw and what was done to him, and whether any of it left marks that cannot be seen. The stain of captivity in the Imperium's merciless culture never fully washes clean. But the Commissar knew this. He knew it when he chose to survive rather than to die. He knew it when he chose to endure degradation rather than to accept the final dignity of death. He knew it, and he made his choice anyway, because survival is not about comfort or reputation or the opinions of others. Survival is about duty, and the Commissar's duty, the duty that was burned into his soul in the forges of the Schola Progenium, and has never, not once, wavered in all the years since, is to serve the Emperor. In life, in death, in captivity, in freedom, in glory, and in shame. The Emperor protects. And sometimes, the way the Emperor protects is by giving his servants the strength to protect themselves. We have spoken at length about the personal horror of a Commissar's captivity. What about the physical brutality and psychological torment that he endures at the hands of the Orks? But it is worth stepping back from the individual experience and considering the broader implications of such an event. Because the capture of a regional Commissar sends ripples through the Imperial war machine that extend far beyond the borders of the battlefield where he fell. The first and most immediate implication is the impact on morale. As we discussed earlier, a Commissar is the moral center of the regiment he serves, the living embodiment of the Emperor's will and the Imperium's expectations. His capture or death leaves a void that is felt not just tactically, but spiritually. The soldiers who served under his authority are left without their moral compass, without the figure who represented both the promise of the Emperor's protection and the threat of the Emperor's punishment. Discipline, which the Commissar maintained through a combination of fear and inspiration, begins to erode. Desertions increase. Morale plummets. The fighting effectiveness of every regiment in the regional Commissar's area of operations is compromised to some degree. The Commissariat itself responds to the loss with its own form of institutional efficiency. A replacement is assigned, drawn from the pool of experienced Commissars available for rapid deployment. This replacement must establish his authority quickly, often in the midst of an ongoing crisis, and he must do so without the benefit of the personal relationships and institutional knowledge that his predecessor had built up over years of service. It is a difficult transition under the best of circumstances, and the circumstances in which a regional Commissar needs to be replaced are never the best. There is also the intelligence dimension to consider. A regional Commissar possesses an extraordinary amount of sensitive information. He knows the dispositions and strengths of every regiment in his area of operations. He knows the communication frequencies and encryption protocols used by Imperial forces. He knows the names and locations of key officers, the strategic plans that have been developed for the sector, the vulnerabilities that Imperial intelligence has identified in the Ork forces. If any of this information falls into enemy hands, even enemy hands as unlikely to use it effectively as the Orks, the potential consequences are severe. Yet the Imperium's response to this intelligence risk is twofold. First, an immediate change of all communication protocols and encryption keys in the affected sector, a massive and disruptive undertaking that diverts resources from the war effort and creates confusion in an already chaotic situation. Second, a reassessment of all strategic plans that the captured Commissar had access to, which may require the abandonment of operations that have been months in the planning and the development of new plans from scratch. The propaganda dimension is equally significant. The Imperium maintains strict control over information, and the capture of a high-ranking officer is the kind of event that the authorities prefer to keep quiet. If word spreads that a regional Commissar has fallen into enemy hands, it could inspire panic among the civilian population, embolden the Imperium's enemies, and provide ammunition to the various heretical and seditious elements that are always looking for evidence that the Imperium is weaker than it claims to be. The Departamento Munitorum may choose to suppress the truth of the Commissar's capture entirely, listing him as killed in action rather than as a prisoner of war. This is a common practice in the Imperium, where the needs of morale and information security routinely override the rights of individuals. and where the truth is considered a luxury that the species cannot always afford. But there is one more implication that is worth considering, one that extends beyond the immediate tactical and strategic consequences of the capture. A commissar who survives Ork captivity and returns to Imperial lines brings with him something that the Imperium possesses in surprisingly short supply: first-hand intelligence about Ork society and culture. The Imperium's understanding of the Orks is, despite millennia of conflict, remarkably incomplete. The Ordo Xenos has devoted considerable resources to the study of greenskin culture and biology, but much of this study has been conducted at arm's length through the analysis of captured specimens and the interrogation of extremely reluctant prisoners. A commissar who has lived among the Orks, who has observed their society from the inside, who has experienced their culture in a way that no human scholar ever has, is an intelligence asset of extraordinary value. His observations about Ork social dynamics, and about the relationships between clans, about the way decisions are made and conflicts resolved, about the strengths and weaknesses of Ork logistics and infrastructure. All of these things have practical applications that could save Imperial lives in future conflicts. His understanding of how Ork camps are organized, how slave populations are managed, how the fighting pits operate, and what purpose they serve in the broader social structure, all of these things contribute to a deeper understanding of an enemy that the Imperium has been fighting for 10,000 years and still does not fully comprehend. Whether the Imperium would actually make use of this intelligence is another question. The Imperium is not known for its institutional agility, and the bureaucratic machinery that processes intelligence reports is slow, cumbersome, and prone to losing documents in the vast labyrinth of the Departamento Munitorum's filing systems. But the intelligence would be there, available to any officer or scholar with the initiative to seek it out. And in the long game of the Imperium's eternal war against the Orks, even the smallest advantage can make a difference. And so we come to the end of our story, though in truth, it is a story that has no end because the war goes on. The Orks will continue to launch their crusades of bloodshed across the stars. The Imperium will continue to send its soldiers to meet them, led by commissars who carry the weight of the Emperor's authority on their shoulders and the certainty of his protection in their hearts. And sometimes, inevitably, those commissars will fall, not to death but to captivity. And they will face the horrors we have described with whatever courage and faith they can muster. What happens when Orks capture a regional commissar is, ultimately, a story about the limits of human endurance and the limitless capacity of the human spirit to resist. It is a story about what it means to serve something greater than yourself, even when that service demands everything you have and then asks for more. It is a story about the strange, brutal, and oddly fascinating culture of the Orks, a species that views the entire galaxy as a playground and every other living thing as either a playmate or a toy. And it is a story about hope. Not the bright, burning hope of the propaganda posters and the recruitment sermons, but the quiet, stubborn, unreasonable hope that lives in the hearts of people who refuse to give up, even when every rational calculation tells them they should. The commissar in his chains, praying to an emperor who may or may not be listening, planning an escape that may or may not be possible, clinging to a faith that may or may not be justified, is the embodiment of that hope. He is the Imperium in miniature, battered and bloodied and surrounded by enemies, but still fighting, still believing, still refusing to accept that the darkness has won. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But within that war, within the endless, grinding, galaxy-spanning conflict that defines the 41st millennium, there are still moments of individual courage and defiance that give the whole terrible enterprise whatever meaning it possesses. The Commissar is one of those moments, and his story, however it ends, is a story worth telling. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most harrowing scenarios in the Warhammer 40k universe, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us bring more of these explorations to you, diving into the darkest corners and most fascinating details of this incredible setting. If there is a topic you would like us to cover in a future video, Leave it in the comments below. We read every single one, and your suggestions often become the inspiration for our next journey into the grimdark future. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember, in the Emperor's name, endure.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.